Welcome to video 2 of 7 from the Roman Army 2021 UofW lecture on basically why do the Romans go to war. And in the second video, I'm going to talk about strategy, in particular highlight the impact of Edward Luttwak. Hope that's pronounced right. So bye-bye my face. Hello strategy. Okay, so basically in war-ish, there are three main levels, okay? At the very top, early, sort of big level, there's strategy. This is all the resources and whatever, the planning that goes into deciding whether to go to war. And there's operations, which is more the supplies, the marching, and the preparations in terms of, accoutrement and materiel. And tactics is sort of how the armies move around and so on in the battle itself. One book has had a huge impact on how we understand Roman strategy. Not everyone buys it, but its impact is undeniable, and we got to discuss it. And this is Edward Luttwak's Grand Strategy. So this is it. The Grand Strategy of the Roman Empire, published in 1976, first century AD, whatever, by Johns Hopkins. Reviews, some people have bought into it, others haven't. Those are just some of the highlights. Mann, one of the early critics, said, not so sure. Isaac says no. Wheeler says yes, kind of no. And Kagan says sort of. Okay. All very interesting discussions, are all important in their own right. So Luttwak's main approach or view is this. And he looked at the Roman security systems, and based on this, looking at, where soldiers were and forts on the frontiers, and focusing on the imperial era, so from Augustus on till the mid-3rd century-ish, a bit beyond. He tried to deduce the organization purpose from this evidence. And his conclusion is that there are three main periods to using this evidence and trying to make sense of it, and then applying it to the topic of strategy. And he's sort of coming to this from more modern research on strategy. And he argued there are three phases. The first phase, which you could say is the Titus Pullo phase, assuming Pullo lived into the Octavian's reign. And this is from Augustus to Nero, and he calls this the economy of force. So they use the resources at their disposal effectively and kind of efficiently, as needed. From the death of Nero to the death of Septimius Severus, so this is from now 68 through about, 211-ish, preclusive security, in which there was a defensible external frontier. So this is when Rome shifts to permanent frontiers, permanent bases on the frontiers and so on. And this is getting well into the era of Aurelius Polion and a bit more. And then we get to the 3rd century crisis, which leads to so-called defense in depth. And this is when Flavius Aemilianus was around. So in this case, you still have some of the fixed components that we find from the second phase, from Nero to Septimius Severus. And but we also have mobile units, so they sort of slow down initial invasions or whatever, and then the mobile forces meet to intercept them. So that roughly is an overview of Luttwak's view. Now, following from this, there are other ways to think about strategy, okay, and this kind of builds on Luttwak and looks at it beyond. And there are all sorts of factors that must be considered when you're thinking about strategy. And basically, important considerations include, are there enough troops locally to respond to a situation? If somebody invades, the Parthians invade the eastern half of the Roman Empire and roughly Syria, are there enough soldiers there? The Romans need to think about withdrawing troops. What happens if you move troops out of an area? Does that destabilize it and leave it open to attack from someone else? So there is a belief, the Romans seem to have had a belief that certain areas required more soldiers, okay, and possibly minimum numbers, and this changed over time. And obviously, there is a view that some areas perceived to be more threatened. Some of this could be internal threats, some of this could be external threats. There are debates about this following Luttwak. One of the things about his view is that he was mostly interested in external threats, so people coming from beyond the empire coming in, whereas others have maybe, depending on where they focus, have looked at the role of the army in controlling issues locally. Okay, obviously knowledge is important, and a big part in all this, if the Romans are going to have any sort of strategy and so on, it's important to think about what they know about their enemies, their land, and what's happening, intel, whatever is important. And if they're going to go to war for whatever reason, based on their strategic position, defenses, etc., the size of their military plays a role as well, and how soldiers moved around before and after campaign were part of this, and there were a lot of pieces involved in deciding whether to go to war. So, and this, if we're looking at Luttwak's three systems, Augustus Nero and so on, and I've shown you a couple, I think, slides and videos that touched on where the frontiers and forts were. Here is a map from one frontier congress, and you can see, so the areas that we're concerned with when we're talking about strategy often are in the imperial era, are, more or less follow sort of north and western Britain, okay, at least in the Roman Britain, with Hadrian's Wall being up here and the Antonine Wall a bit later, and then more or less from the edge of the desert in through Egypt and the Near East, with these triangles being sort of important legionary bases, and the red ones important cities, and you can see them following rivers and so on. Anyway, so that's a little overview of Luttwak and some of the points that you need to be considering when looking at strategy in the big picture in the Roman Empire.